This is the Before You Read lecture for Judges 1 through 8. In this lecture, I will provide a brief orientation to the book of Judges as a whole and to some of the high points of the first 8 chapters. The book of Judges gets its name from the various tribal leaders who played a leadership role among the people of Israel. The book imagines a form of communal life in transition. The people have settled in the Promised Land, but they have not yet become a unified nation with a single ruler, like many of the nations surrounding them. Scholars are not sure of all of the details related to this period in Israel's history. It is not altogether clear how many tribes are imagined. In one place in the book of Judges, there is an emphasis on 12 tribes, but in another place, only 10 tribes are mentioned. In addition, there are other tribes introduced in the narrative, but they are not included in the list of Israel's tribes. Likewise, the book assumes a basic knowledge or understanding of what the tribe was, but we don't necessarily have an understanding of that as well. So there are no explicit explanations of what a tribe consists of, or who composed each tribe, or even how the different tribes related to one another in terms of social, economic, and political interactions. Scholars who turn to anthropological models to fill out some of the detail omitted by the book of Judges suggest some important details. As the New Interpreter's Study Bible puts it, a tribe was, quote, probably constituted out of a combination of kinship and territorial groups, a collection of towns and villages associated with particular clans or lineages. So again, you can begin to imagine some of the dissonance, some of the conflicts that would arise when civilization or the collection of humans are organized around different kinship or clan groups, and how there might arise one leader in that clan who's more important than others. And so again, turning to anthropology helps us flesh out some of the details in the book of Judges. Like other parts of the Old Testament, the stories that make up the book of Judges are probably very old, at least in oral form. It is likely that the stories of different figures or charismatic leaders were handed down orally from one tribe or group to another. The final form of the book of Judges most likely took shape around the period of the Babylonian exile, sometime after the fall of Judah in 6th century BCE. As such, there are details in the text that reflect the concerns and the social world of this period post-fall of Judah, rather than the period of the Judges. While Judges likely contains some elements of historical memory, these are difficult to discern with any certainty. But again, it is worth pointing out that Judges, like most of the Old Testament, contains theological narrative. The author offers interpretations of the events of the past in a way that is relevant and significant for his audience. These are not mere historical writings. They are rather works of theological reflection with the author's contemporary audience in mind. How do we make these stories relevant for us? How do these stories provide a filter for us to understand what's going on around us? In this way, the book of Judges is an example of what we do on Sunday morning when we preach or when we do Bible study. It is this effort, this impulse to say, how do these texts resonate with us? How do they provide context for us? How do they inform us? As you read the book of Judges, you will notice that the judges play a number of different roles. Sometimes they are military leaders, freeing Israel or part of Israel from their subjection to another nation. Other times they're more like administrators, helping one tribe or multiple tribes work out their conflicts. There are two sort of distinctive types of judges that you might be aware of. First, there are those who are said to act as a judge over all of Israel. And so the book of Judges will provide a few details about their birth and their burial, maybe their families, their wealth, and their lengths of office. But the actual details of their leadership, what they did, is lacking. So that brings us to the second type of judges. These are judges who often relate to particular tribes. and more details are given about their actions and their behaviors, often highlighting their militaristic success. What is apparent, though, or through all of this, is that there was not a clear, structured process for identifying or selecting judges. It seems to have been a far more dynamic and organic process. Notice the times that it said that the Spirit or that the Lord raised up a judge. And think about how the community went about going to discerning the work of the Holy Spirit or the work of God. It is important to note that the death of Joshua really serves as the prologue or the backdrop for the book of Judges. Not only is his death recounted in Joshua 24, setting the stage for the period of the Judges, but the book of Judges itself also makes explicit reference to this event. The first verse of Judges opens with "after the death of Joshua," and then briefly traces the role of each tribe and what they played in the conquest of, and the role they played in the conquest of the Promised Land. Then in chapter 2, the narrative again focuses on Joshua and his death. The focus on Joshua sets the stage for the central questions of the rest of the book, right? What will Israel do now that they've entered into the Promised Land? How will they organize themselves and interact with their neighbors? And above all, will they remain faithful to God in this new stage of their life together? This central question of faithfulness is apparent in Joshua 24 and Judges 2, but the two texts offer very different perspectives on the people of Israel's relationship to God. In Joshua 24, the people of Israel are eager, emphatic to remain faithful to God. They recommit themselves to the way of God, and they remember God's powerful actions in the past. But things are very different in Judges 2. The narrative suggests that the people of Israel continue to worship other gods, and that becomes a central problem in Judges. This is another place for us to think carefully about the role of memory and commemoration, both in the narrative level of the story and at the level of the author and audience of Judges. How does Israel remember their past as it relates to Egypt or the wilderness, the Promised Land, in the time of Joshua? As you will see, it seems as though there really is a narrative of decline. The people saw and praised God for deliverance in former generations, but now they've forgotten that and they've gone after other gods. Once again, we see this as the author's attempt to grapple with the fall of Judah and the people's loss of autonomy several centuries after the events described in the book of Judges. In chapters 3 through 8, there is a pretty distinct narrative pattern, and it goes something like this. First, the author remarks that Israel has done what is evil in the sight of the Lord. More often than not, this is expressed in religious terms. The people of Israel have venerated other gods. They've gone after the gods of the other nations. Now, it is worth noting that the evil that Israel does is almost exclusively religious, not moral or social. There is nothing of Prophet Amos's critique of Israel's treatment of the poor or the widows. To put it in terms of the Ten Commandments, Judges seems almost exclusively concerned with the covenant relationship between God and the people of Israel, not the Israelites' covenant obligations to one another. The next component in the narrative outlines God's response to the people's misdeeds. Again, it is pretty standard. God is said to sell or hand over the people of Israel to another nation. Again, it's worth noting that religious infidelity is met with political consequences. The third component in the narrative highlights the role of the judges. Often the narrative says that God raised up a judge, God appointed or gave a special spirit or charism to a member of one of the tribal groups. The judge plays a martial or sometimes a prophetic role, releasing the people from their political bondage and leading them back into right relationship with God. The final component in the narrative pattern emphasizes a time of political peace and religious fidelity, but only for a period of time, and then the pattern repeats itself. From this narrative pattern, the theological convictions of Judges become apparent. On one hand, times of national security are guaranteed by religious fidelity. On the other hand, times of national insecurity or subjection are caused by religious infidelity. Seen from the perspective of life after the fall of Judah, these theological convictions help the people of Israel make sense of their trauma. The fall of Judah is not a unique event, nor should it cause the people of Israel to wonder about God's care for them. Instead, it suggests a sort of consistency. God has always worked this way, and since Judah fell, it must have been because of their religious infidelity. In previous lectures, I have mentioned the Deuteronomistic history or the Deuteronomistic theology, and it should be evident the degree to which Judges is a part of this. God blesses those who are faithful, and God curses those who are not faithful. And so we can see how the book of Judges really works that out in its own particular way with the story of the Judges. As you read, try to keep questions related to life together and leadership in mind. What do we learn about human communities in the book of Judges? What do we learn about leadership? The book of Judges assumes a form of governance that is very different from our own system of democracy or even the older structures of absolute monarchies. But do you see any areas of correspondence between the form of governance in Judges and in our contemporary society? Next, pay attention to the different roles of the judges. What do they do? How do they do it? What does it mean to judge Israel? And as you notice the different roles of the judges, you will likely see how the narrative emphasizes certain figures like Deborah and Barak or Gideon. Do you resonate with any of these figures? If so, why? Finally, this portion of Judges gives a lot of attention, probably the most extended attention in this section, to the judge Gideon. As you read this, look for ways that Gideon resembles both Moses and Joshua before him. How is Gideon's experience like that of Moses? How is it like that of Joshua? What do you think this says about the author's perspective or purpose in telling this developed story about Gideon? I can't wait to see and hear what you see as you engage this part of Judges. Happy reading.